I have been hauling freight for 31 years. I want to say that first, because everything that follows depends on you understanding what that means. 31 years of manifest sheets and weight declarations, of tie-down inspections and dimensional tolerances, of dock supervisors who hate you and customs officers who love paperwork more than they love their own children. 31 years of bays that smell like hydraulic fluid and old sealant foam, of sleeping in the cab on layovers because the waystation bunk fee eats your margin, of eating the same 6 things from the same 6 vendors at every port on the inner route circuit, because at least you know what you're getting. I want to say that I am a man who has followed the manifest. That is not self-flattery. Following the manifest is not a moral virtue. It is the condition of doing the work. You carry what the manifest says you are carrying. You deliver it to where the manifest says it is going. And you do not open sealed cargo, and you do not reroute without authorization, and you do not tell the consignment holder that you disagree with their business practices. You are the operator. You are not the judge. In 31 years, I have never been the judge. I am not a young man who was looking for something to prove. I am 52 years old, and I was 6 weeks from my last run. I want to say that too, 6 weeks. I had the paperwork drawn up. The licensing authority had my cessation of trade notification on file. My freight bond was current through the 31st of the following month, and after that it was done. I had a sister in Tethmar settlement who had been telling me for 8 years to come stay with her and help her run the property. I had a bad hip that had been bad since I was 44, and that had, in the last year, gone from nuisance to something I could not ignore anymore. I had a truck that I had driven for 19 years and that I was going to sell for parts and not feel bad about it, because the truck had earned its rest as surely as I had. 6 weeks. The consignment came through the standard freight matching service, same as every other job. Origin point, Orithkal Way Station, Outer Transit Ring 7, Loading Bay 49. Destination, Cellarport Biological Receiving Facility, Pier 12, Sector D. Contents declared as biological survey specimens, inert, packaged for transit. Category, Class 3 biological cargo. Special handling instructions. Maintain ambient temperature between 14 and 22 degrees. No inversion, no impact above 2 gravities, no unauthorized access to individual units. 12 crates. The rate was good, better than good. I should have wondered about the rate. I have thought about that many times since. The rate was set 12% above standard Class 3 biological, which is the kind of number that makes a 31-year freight operator feel like he's getting a fair deal from the universe for once in his life. It did not occur to me that 12% above standard is also a number designed to attract operators who do not ask questions. I was 6 weeks from done. I was tired. I had a bad hip and a retirement filing and a sister who kept sending me photographs of her property's north view because she knew I would like the north view. I accepted the job. I will tell you about the crates. 11 of them were standard. White polymer shell, foam-padded interior, the kind of thing you see in biological survey consignments a dozen times a year. Survey outfits collect all kinds of things: soil samples, tissue specimens, atmospheric particulates, water chemistry samples sealed in glass vials nested in foam. The 11 standard crates were cool to the touch and inert, and smelled faintly of the preservation compound they use in survey-grade specimen packaging. I have smelled that compound so many times that I would know it in my sleep. It smells like acetate and something faintly sweet, like synthetic vanilla that has been left in the sun too long. The 12th crate was different. It was the same dimensions as the others. It had the same white polymer shell. It had the same foam-padded interior, or so the declaration said, because the manifest listed it as HVS 7, high-value species, and attached to its side was a laminated orange tag, roughly 10 centimeters by 6, pre-punched in the upper left corner as though it had been threaded on a cord at some point, and the cord removed. The tag read in black printed text, High Value Species, Acquisition CERT. 7 VAALI 91, Class 3 Biological, Do Not Open Hazardous Material, Authorized Handling Only. I read the tag. I noted the acquisition certificate number. I verified against the manifest that this was the correct crate for that certificate. I filed the cross-check in my head the way I have filed 10,000 cross-checks over 31 years. Registered, confirmed, proceed. I closed the bay and started the truck. I want to tell you exactly when I first knew something was wrong, because it matters. It was 4 hours out of Orithkal, in the Transit 7 corridor, well past the outer marker. I had done a mid-haul bay check, which I do on every run regardless of cargo type, because a load that was properly secured when you left the bay is not always still properly secured 4 hours later, and because I am 31 years into this work, and I do not skip the bay check. I was walking the tie-down points on the starboard row of crates, checking each anchor strap, when I passed the HVS-7 crate and noticed 2 things. The first thing I noticed was warmth. Class 3 biological cargo at ambient temperature maintenance between 14 and 22 degrees runs cool to the touch. Not cold, not frozen, but below body temperature. The 11 standard crates were cool. The HVS-7 crate was not. It was warm. It was warm in the way that a living thing in a small enclosed space is warm, which is a different warmth than any ambient temperature mechanical process produces. Ambient temperature warmth is even. Living warmth is not even. It pools. It radiates from a center point in a way that has a directionality to it, a density, that no chemical or mechanical process quite replicates. The second thing I noticed was sound. I stood in the bay for a long time and I listened. The truck makes noise. It always makes noise. 31 years of knowing every note in that truck's register means I know the difference between the truck's noise and something else. The something else I heard was faint. It was periodic. It had an interval of approximately 4 seconds between repetitions. It was the sound of something breathing in a small space. I went back to the cab. I sat in the cab for 11 minutes by the dash clock. I thought about the job. I thought about the manifest. I thought about the rate, 12% above standard, and the do not open instruction on the orange laminated tag, and the acquisition certificate number 7 VAALI 91, and the Class 3 biological designation, and the warmth, and the sound. Class 3 biological covers a very wide range of things. Survey outfits work across dozens of systems. They collect and transport all kinds of living material, microorganisms in sealed vials, small invertebrate specimens, tissue cultures, botanical cuttings with root masses in breathable foam. Class 3 biological cargo can be warm and can make faint sounds, and this is entirely routine, and there is no regulation that requires a freight operator to open sealed biological cargo, regardless of perceived anomalies in temperature or ambient sound. And in fact, the handling instructions explicitly prohibit unauthorized opening of individual units. I have always followed the handling instructions, 31 years. I thought about the warmth again. I have carried live specimens before. Twice in my career, I have carried sealed crates containing small vertebrate animals. Once a consignment of domesticated species for a frontier settlement that had placed an order for breeding stock. Once a single crate of research animals en route to a Federation veterinary facility. Both times the warmth was even. Both times the sound was either absent or continuous. Neither time had the sound been periodic at 4-second intervals, with the specific quality of depth and rhythm that I was sitting in the cab listening to in my memory. I knew what I was hearing. I had known it in the bay. I had come back to the cab because there is a difference between knowing something and being ready to act on it, and I needed 11 minutes to close that distance. I went back to the bay. I opened the crate. The HVS-7 tag was affixed to the crate's exterior. Inside, threaded on a thin filament around the child's left wrist, was a second copy, the same orange laminate, the same black text, the same pre-punched hole, the filament threaded through it and knotted. High-value species, acquisition CERT, 7 VALI 91, printed on the wrist of a living child the way you would print a label on a jar of soil samples. She was small. She was HFY, which I knew from the skin color, a pale lavender, the kind that looks almost silver in low light, and from the oversized amber eyes that came open the instant the lid came off and fixed on my face with an expression I will try to describe accurately. Not fear, not relief, not a plea. She was watching me the way you watch something that has not yet decided what it is going to do, and your survival depends on your reading it correctly before it moves. The specific watchfulness of something very small and very intelligent that has learned not to trust anything until it proves trustworthy. She was coiled in the center of the crate in the foam packaging. She was wearing a faded gray tunic that was too large for her, the shoulders drooping, the hem pulled around her. Her silver-white hair was pressed flat on one side from where she had been lying. She did not move. She did not make a sound. She just watched me. Her left wrist was at her side. The orange tag was on her left wrist. I have gone over and over this moment in my memory since. What I felt is difficult to translate into something that doesn't sound like what a man tells himself afterward to make himself seem coherent. What I actually felt in the moment, standing over that crate in the bay of my truck 4 hours out of Orthcall, was something that started in my chest and moved outward along my arms and did not have a name. Not rage. Rage comes hot and fast and makes noise. This was cold. This was the feeling of something becoming permanently clear. I said, "I'm not going to hurt you." She did not respond. I did not expect her to. I said it because I needed to say it, because the alternative was standing there saying nothing, and I did not know what nothing communicated in HFY body language, and I knew what it communicated in mine. I reached into the crate, very slowly, and I took the filament between my thumb and forefinger, and I looked at the knot. It was a simple double-loop knot, the kind used in industrial packaging. I worked it open with my thumbnail. The filament came free. I lifted the orange tag off her wrist and I held it in my hand. She watched my hands the whole time. When the tag came free, she looked from my hands to my face, and something in the watchfulness changed, though I could not have told you precisely how. I set the tag on the floor of the bay beside the crate. I stepped back. I gave her space. I said, "You're going to need water. I'll get you water. Stay here." I went to the cab, got the water container I keep under the passenger seat, came back. I set it on the floor in front of the crate, where she could reach it without having to come close to me. I sat down on the bay floor, my back against the portside crate rack, 6 feet away, so that she could see my hands and I was not between her and the door. She watched me for a long time without moving. Then she reached out slowly and picked up the water container. I sat there and let her drink and thought about what I was going to do. The manifest said, 12 crates, Class 3 biological, delivered to Cellarport Biological Receiving Facility, Pier 12, Sector D. The acquisition certificate said, high-value species, acquisition authorized under Federation Biological Survey Charter 7 VALI, category biological sample, Class 3. It did not say, in any field on any page, that the specimen in question was a living child with amber eyes and silver-white hair, and a way of watching you that made you understand she had done this before, been in the dark, in the small space, had the lid come off, had a face look down at her, and had learned not to show what she felt until she knew what was coming. I thought about Cellarport Biological Receiving Facility. I had delivered to Cellarport 3 times in my career. Pier 12, Sector D, is not the general receiving dock. Pier 12, Sector D, is the holding facility. I have heard it called, among operators who talk at the fueling stations, the vivarium. What goes into Pier 12, Sector D, is not released into the general logistics chain. It goes into temperature-controlled holding, and then it goes to private collectors, to research facilities, to the kind of buyers who pay 12% above standard rate for delivery of something that they do not want anyone to look at too closely. I have known this for years, the way you know a lot of things you don't have to act on because the cargo is never yours to decide about. You deliver what the manifest says, and you don't open the crates, and you don't ask about Pier 12, and you go home, and you sleep fine because you never looked. I had looked. I thought about what happened to things that went into Pier 12, Sector D, not in a vague way. I know what research facilities do with Class 3 biological specimens, because I have carried the outgoing end of that business as well, packaged remnants, sealed and sterilized, on their way to incineration or deep burial disposal under the environmental protocols that apply to biological waste. That is the other end of what Pier 12 receives. I have always told myself that is not my calculation to make. The manifest is the document. The document is the job. The child was watching me from 6 feet away. I thought about what she had learned, whoever she was, wherever she had been before she was in the crate, to make her the kind of person who did not scream when the lid came off, who watched the face before she decided anything, who waited to see what the hands did before she decided whether the hands were safe. Whatever had made her this careful and this quiet and this particular kind of watchful, it had not come from nowhere. It had been taught to her by something that had happened, and the something that had happened because of the system that produced the crate and the tag and the acquisition certificate and the 12% above standard rate. I had known about the vivarium for years, and I had made 7 runs to Cellarport, and none of them had been to Pier 12, and I had never had a reason to make it my business. I want to be honest about that because it is part of the truth of what I am telling you. The system runs on operators who do not look. I had not looked. I am not going to rewrite that history. I carried things I did not examine to places I did not interrogate, and that is the record. And the record is not something I am proud of. But I had looked now. I sat on the floor of my bay, my bad hip pressing into the cold composite, and I thought about 31 years of not asking questions. I thought about the acquisition certificate number printed on the tag in my hand. I thought about the child 6 feet away who was still watching me over the rim of the water container. I thought about my retirement filing and my sister's North View and my truck that I was going to sell for parts next month. I thought 6 weeks ago I could have taken a different job. I thought I didn't. I picked up the orange tag off the floor. I put it in my breast pocket. I stood up carefully because of my hip. I said to the child, "I'm not taking you to Cellarport." She was still watching me. I don't know what she understood. I do not speak Kethvali beyond a handful of commercial terms, none of which were useful in this context. But I have moved freight for 31 years, and in that time I have worked alongside and around representatives of 14 species, and I have learned that you can communicate a very limited set of things across any language barrier, if you are willing to be slow and deliberate about it. I held out my hand. Not to grab her, not to pull her toward me. Just the open palm, the way you'd show someone you weren't holding anything. She looked at the hand for a long time. Then she put her own hand in it. Small fingers, lavender pale, closing around 2 of mine with a grip that was careful and deliberate, and nothing like the reflex grip of a frightened child. It was a decision. I said, "All right." I closed the bay and went back to the cab, and pulled up the nav console. I want to explain, for anyone reading this who has never operated a long-haul freight rig in the Federation outer route system, what changing a declared consignment's destination mid-transit actually involves. You cannot simply input a new destination and proceed. The manifest is a live document. Any deviation from the declared route is automatically flagged by the Transit Authority's nav monitoring system, which exists specifically to prevent cargo theft and trafficking. which is an irony I was aware of even at the time. A deviation flag triggers a compliance hold at the next way station, which means an inspection, which means the manifest gets opened by a transit officer, which means the HVS-7 crate gets inspected, which means the child gets found and the acquisition company gets called, and the whole situation becomes a transit authority matter rather than a freight operator matter. This is the system as it is designed to work. I am not saying it is a bad system. I am saying that in this specific case, at this specific moment, it was the wrong tool. A compliance hold at a way station means the crate gets opened by a transit officer following procedure, which means the acquisition company is notified before the compact commission is, which means there are lawyers on the phone before there are safe passage officers in the room. I have been in enough freight disputes to know what happens when lawyers arrive first. I thought about what I had. I had a child, HFY, small, apparently uninjured. I had a laminated orange tag with an acquisition certificate number on it. I had 12 crates of Class 3 biological cargo, 11 of which were legitimate survey samples. I had a freight bond current through the 31st of the following month. I had 31 years of documentation of clean delivery records, no compliance violations, no flags. I had 3 hours until the first NavCheck waypoint. I thought about this carefully. I am not a man who has ever broken a transit regulation in 31 years. I want to be precise about what I mean by that. I have worked close to the edge of regulations, the way all long-haul operators do, because the edge is where the work lives. I have taken jobs where the cargo was not what I would have chosen to carry if someone had asked my opinion, which they never did. I have delivered things I did not feel good about to places I did not think well of, and I slept fine. And I am not going to rewrite 31 years of history to say I was an innocent man who never knew what the outer route circuit carried. But I had the child in my bay and the tag in my pocket, and I was going to have to make a decision that was going to cost me something regardless of which way I made it. Here is what I did. I called Port Seller. Not Pier 12, Sector D Port Seller itself, the main facility administration, the public access line. I identified myself by my freight operator license number. I asked to be connected to the Federation Safe Passage Desk. Every port facility in the Federation outer system is required by the Compact Accord to maintain a safe passage desk. The requirement has been on the books since the third expansion-era resettlement agreements. Most of the desks are staffed part-time by whoever the facility can spare, and most of them handle 1 or 2 cases a year involving displaced persons, stranded travelers, or the occasional compact protected species member who has ended up in a transit system in some kind of difficulty. They are not heavily used. They exist because the Compact Accord requires them to exist, and because the Federation likes to have structures on paper that demonstrate its commitment to certain values. I was about to make one of them worth the paper it was written on. The officer who answered was young. I could hear it in his voice, the specific flatness of someone who has been staffing an administrative line that almost never rings and has therefore developed a telephone voice designed for the routine. When I told him I had a HFY miner in my cargo bay, aboard a freight truck in transit in the Transit 7 corridor, transported under an acquisition certificate designating her as Class 3 biological high-value species cargo, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Can you say that again, please?" I said it again, slowly. I gave him the acquisition certificate number. I gave him my freight operator license number. I gave him my current nav position. I told him I was requesting safe passage processing for a miner under Compact Accord Section 14, displaced miner protections, and that I would be arriving at Port Seller main facility rather than at the declared destination, and that I understood this constituted a manifest deviation, and I was filing a voluntary disclosure of the deviation at this time. I said, "I have the specimen tag. I will surrender it to your desk on arrival. It has the acquisition certificate number on it. It constitutes documentation of compact violation under the terms of the accord." He said, "I'm going to need to escalate this." I said, "That's fine." I hung up. I sat in the cab for a moment. My hip hurt. The freight console was showing me the NavCheck waypoint coming up in 2 hours 40 minutes. I had just voluntarily flagged my own manifest deviation, which meant the transit authority would know about the reroute before I arrived, which meant there would be officers at Port Cellar when I got there, which meant there was now no version of this where I arrived quietly and handed the child over and drove away without anyone knowing my name. I had known that when I picked up the phone. I want to be clear about that. I did not make the call under any illusion that it would be clean. I went back to the bay. She had moved. She was no longer in the crate. She was sitting on the floor of the bay near the crate, her back against the portside rack, the same spot where I had been sitting with the water container in her lap. She had found in the corner of the bay near the equipment locker a cargo blanket that I used to pad irregularly shaped loads, and she had pulled it around her shoulders. It was a gray equipment blanket, heavy canvas, printed with the Transit Authority's batch number on the corner in yellow ink. It was much too large for her. She looked like a very small person who had found a tent and decided the tent would do. I stood in the bay doorway and looked at her, and felt something shift in my chest that I was not expecting. I said, "Okay, we're going to Port Cellar. It's going to take about 4 more hours." I held up 4 fingers. 4 is a number that crosses most species barriers tolerably well in my experience. She looked at the 4 fingers. She looked at my face. I said, "Safe. You're going to be safe." I don't know if she understood the word. I know she was watching my face when I said it, and I know that I meant it in the way you mean something when there is no longer any version of meaning it halfway. I went back to the cab. I rerouted. I filed the voluntary deviation. I ate the bar of compressed grain food that I keep in the passenger door pocket for long corridors, and I thought about nothing for a while, because there was nothing useful to think about until we arrived. An hour later she came into the cab. She came up the steps from the bay one at a time, slowly, the blanket still around her shoulders, and she stood in the doorway between the cab and the bay for a moment looking at the dashboard and the windscreen and the Transit 7 corridor visible ahead. I glanced at her and then looked back at the road. I did not make any large movements. After a moment she came and stood at the passenger side of the cab. The passenger seat of my truck has a step assist bar on it from when my sister's younger daughter used to ride with me on school break runs many years ago. It folds down from under the seat. I reached over slowly and folded it down without looking directly at the child. She used it. She climbed up onto the passenger seat and sat in it with the blanket around her and looked at the corridor ahead. We drove for 3 hours. I don't know what she was thinking. I know she watched the corridor with a steadiness that was not boredom and not anxiety and not wonder, exactly, more the steadiness of a person who has decided to pay attention to something because paying attention is all you have sometimes, and it is better than not paying attention. She did not fidget. She did not make sounds. Once she put her hand on the dashboard, flat-palmed, and looked at it there for a moment, and I didn't know what that meant and I didn't ask. I turned the heating up a fraction. I do not know the specific thermal comfort range of Keth Valley physiology. I know the cab had been running at my preferred temperature, which is the preference of a man who has been cold on too many early morning loading shifts and compensates. She had not made any sign of discomfort. I turned it up anyway, on the reasonable premise that a child who had spent an unknown period of time in a sealed polymer crate had earned a warm cab. I did not play the radio. I run the radio on long corridors as a habit, the low-frequency freight traffic channels that mostly carry routing updates and weather advisories and the occasional operator talking to himself. I turned it off when she climbed into the seat without thinking about it, and then realized I had done it and left it off. The cab was quieter without the radio. That seemed like the right call. At some point during those 3 hours, she fell asleep in the passenger seat with the equipment blanket around her. I don't know exactly when it happened because I was watching the corridor. When I noticed, she was fully asleep, her head tipped back slightly against the seat rest, her breathing the same 4-second rhythm I had heard in the bay, but slower now. The interval stretched to something closer to 6 seconds. She was holding one corner of the equipment blanket with both hands. I looked at her for a moment, then I looked back at the corridor. I thought, this is a child who has learned to sleep when conditions allow, because she does not know when conditions will allow it again. I thought she learned that somewhere, in the time before she was in my bay. I did not let myself think past that. There was a certain amount of knowing I was prepared to carry in the cab for the remaining hours of that drive, and there was a certain amount I was not, and I had already taken on as much of the second kind as I was going to take on today. 1 hour out of Port Cellar, she woke up. She was fully present the instant she opened her eyes, the same way she had been fully present the instant I lifted the lid off the crate. Whatever sleep she did, it was practice sleep, the kind where you keep a part of yourself listening. I said, there are going to be people there, officers. They're going to ask questions and they're going to want to process you, which means forms and scans and things I can't prevent. I'm going to be there the whole time. She looked at me. I felt, not for the first time on that drive, that she was understanding more than the words. I've got something that's going to help, I said. I touched my breast pocket where the orange tag was. It's yours. I took it off your wrist. I'm going to give it to someone who can use it properly. She looked at my breast pocket. She looked at my face. Then she looked back at the corridor and I thought, all right, we're doing this. Port Cellar is a big facility. Main terminal, 12 commercial piers, a Federation Transit Authority annex, and tucked into the east end of the terminal building near the cargo assessment offices, the safe passage desk. It is the size of a broom cupboard. This is not a figure of speech. It has a sliding door and a counter and 2 chairs, and a poster on the wall in 4 languages explaining what the Compact Accord Section 14 protections cover. The young officer I had spoken to on the phone was behind the counter when I arrived, and there were 2 Transit Authority officers standing to the side of the desk, and there was a woman in a Federation Compact liaison uniform who had clearly been called in specifically for this, and had the look of someone who had not expected to be needed today and was recalibrating accordingly. I walked in with the child beside me. She had kept the cargo blanket. She walked at my left side, not holding my hand, not touching me, but close, the specific closeness of someone who has made a decision about proximity and is honoring it without making it a performance. The Compact liaison officer went down on one knee when she saw the child, which was the right thing to do, and spoke something in what I recognized as a coastal dialect approximation of Keth Valley, which she clearly knew imperfectly but was trying with, and the child looked at her with the same steady amber watchfulness she had used on everything since I opened the crate, and then, after a long moment, said something back. Quiet. 3 syllables. I don't know what it meant. I know the liaison officer sat back a little, like the sound had landed somewhere in her chest. I reached into my breast pocket, and I put the orange laminated tag on the counter. Acquisition Certificate 7 VAALI 91, I said. Filed under Federation Biological Survey Charter 7 VAALI, Class 3, Biological, High-Value Species Designation. That tag was threaded on a filament around her left wrist when I opened the crate. The young officer looked at the tag. He looked at me. He picked up the tag with 2 fingers, the way you pick up something you are going to need for evidence, which was correct, and he put it in a clear specimen sleeve and sealed it. You said in your call you'd be filing a voluntary manifest deviation disclosure, he said. Filed it when I made the call, I said. You'll have the nav record. Deviation point is time-stamped. One of the Transit Authority officers said, the consignment holder has already filed a complaint. They're saying unauthorized cargo access and freight theft. I said, they can say that. You're looking at a freight bond review, the officer said. Potentially a suspension. I know, I said. The compact liaison officer was still with the child. She had sat down on the floor of the broom cupboard. There was not enough room to sit on the second chair and be at eye level, and the child was still looking at her with the amber eyes and the careful watchfulness. I said to the young officer, the acquisition certificate number on that tag is going to pull up a Federation Biological Survey Charter registration. When you pull that registration, you're going to find that high-value species Class 3 biological designation under Charter 7 VAALI covers tissue samples and inert organic specimens. It does not cover living sentient minors. The HFY are a compact protected species under the Third Accord. Any acquisition of a living compact member minor requires Section 12 authorization from the Federation Compact Commission, which requires individual case review and commission signatory approval, and takes a minimum of 90 days to complete. Acquisition Certificate 7 VAALI 91 was not issued under Section 12. It was issued under the Standard Biological Survey Charter, which does not cover living sentient beings. I had worked this out during the drive. I have 31 years of reading manifests and charter designations, and the gaps between what documents say and what documents mean. And I had spent 3 hours while the child slept going through the implications of that acquisition certificate number with the particular attention I give to cargo claims that don't square up with what I know about how the system works. The Charter 7 VAALI covers 43 active survey operations across this sector, I said. When you start pulling the other acquisition certificates under that charter, I would expect you to find similar problems. The young officer looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the tag in the specimen sleeve on the counter. He said, "You know this is going to be a significant investigation." "I expect it is," I said. "Your cooperation will be required." "You have my license number," I said. "I'm not hard to find." I looked at the child. She had turned from the liaison officer and was looking at me. The cargo blanket was still around her shoulders. She was sitting on the floor of the safe passage desk, in the broom cupboard at the east end of Port Cellar Terminal, with 4 people in the room and proceedings beginning around her that would take months to resolve, and she was looking at me with those amber eyes and the same expression she had had when I opened the crate. The careful watchfulness, the decision not yet made. I crouched down, my hip complained. I put myself at her level, the way you do when you want to be readable to something small and careful and very much paying attention. I don't know what she saw in my face. I know what I was trying to show her, which was the same thing I had tried to show her in the bay of my truck when I said the word safe. I meant it, and I was not sure she could read my face, and I could not speak her language well enough to give it to her in words, and all I had was the thing itself and the intention behind it. She reached out and put her hand on my face. Small fingers, lavender pale. She pressed her palm against my cheek the way you'd press it against a warm surface to read the heat of it. She held it there for a moment. I stayed still. I did not move. I let her read whatever she was reading. Then she took her hand back. She turned back to the liaison officer and said something, more than 3 syllables this time, a longer sequence. And the liaison officer listened carefully. And then the liaison officer looked up at me with an expression I couldn't fully interpret and said, "She says you opened the crate and you took off the thing on her wrist." "That's right," I said. The liaison officer said, "She says the ones before didn't do that." I stayed crouched for another moment, even though my hip was making strong representations to the contrary. "This one did," I said. I stood up. I straightened my jacket. I said to the young officer, "I'll leave my contact information with your desk. I'm going to need to sort my freight bond situation, and I'll be available for whatever interviews the Compact Commission requires." I walked out of the safe passage desk. I walked across the terminal and out to the freight lot where I had parked my truck, and I got in and I sat in the cab for a few minutes with my hands on the wheel and my hip resting, and the Transit 7 corridor not in front of me anymore. Just the port cellar freight lot, gray prefab buildings, loading equipment, a row of container haulers that weren't mine. Then I started the truck and I drove out of the port. Here is what happened in the following weeks, briefly, because I don't want to spend more time on it than it deserves. The freight bond review was initiated within 48 hours, as the transit authority officer had told me it would be. The consignment holder, a biological survey entity operating under the name Valley Resource Acquisition Partners, filed an unauthorized cargo access complaint and a freight theft claim within 6 hours of my arrival at Port Cellar. The freight theft claim was for the value of one high-value species specimen, Acquisition Certificate 7 VAALI 91. The valuation listed on the claim was a number I am not going to write down, because putting a number on a child in writing, even to describe someone else's valuation, is something I decline to do. The freight bond review found, after 6 weeks, that my voluntary deviation disclosure and the circumstances of the deviation justified a suspended review rather than a full suspension. In practical terms, this meant my bond remained valid through its expiry date and was then allowed to lapse without renewal. Since I had already filed cessation of trade notification, this was functionally what was going to happen anyway. I lost nothing that I was not already in the process of setting down. Valley Resource Acquisition Partners Federation Biological Survey Charter 7 VAALI was suspended within 30 days of the Port Cellar incident, pending investigation of acquisition practices across all 43 active survey operations under the charter. 3 of the 4 named partners in the entity were subsequently subject to Compact Commission investigation. I do not know the final outcome of those proceedings. I was interviewed twice by Federation investigators and provided a full statement both times. I have not followed the case closely since then. I will tell you what I know about the child, which is limited. The Compact Liaison Officer contacted me twice during the processing period. The first contact was to inform me that the child had been verified as a Keth Valley minor, Compact protected, and that her case had been referred to the Keth Valley Diaspora Resettlement Commission for family tracing and placement. The second contact was to tell me that the processing had been completed and that she was no longer in Port Cellar's safe passage facility. That was all I was told, and I did not ask for more. The child was not mine to track. I had carried her as far as I could carry her and handed her to people who could carry her further, and the further carrying was not my work. I understood that, and I was at peace with it, and I am still at peace with it. The orange tag, Acquisition Certificate 7 VAALI 91, 10 centimeters by 6, pre-punched hole, black text on laminated orange stock, is listed in the Compact Commission's case evidence file as Item 4. I know this because I received a receipt for it when I surrendered it at the Port Cellar desk, and the receipt has the item number on it. I kept the receipt. It is in the same pocket where the tag was, folded twice, carried through the rest of the run home and into my sister's property and sitting, now in the drawer of the bedside table in the room with the north view. My sister asked me once what was in the drawer. I said a receipt. She said, for what? I said, something I delivered. She gave me a look that said she knew there was more to it than that, and also that she was going to leave it alone, which is one of the things I have always valued about my sister. She has the Northview property and the sense to let things rest when they are resting. I have thought many times about the child's hand on my face, the palm flat against my cheek, reading the heat of it. I do not know what she was measuring. I do not know what the gesture means in Keth Valley communication, whether it is a question, a statement, a form of assessment, a form of acknowledgement. I have looked into it enough to know that the coastal dialect of Keth Valley uses what translators describe as a contact affirmation gesture in situations of established trust, which is a phrase that I have turned over many times. Established trust. I had known her for approximately 6 hours. She had been in the dark in the small space, and the lid had come off, and a face had looked down at her. And she had watched the face and watched the hands and watched what the hands did, and then she had put her hand on my face. I have been a freight operator for 31 years. I have carried things I did not look at and delivered them to places I did not think about, and this is the truth of the work, and I am not going to say it isn't. I have told myself, as all of us tell ourselves, that the manifest is the document and the document is the job, and the job is what you do or you do not do, and there is nothing in between. There was something in between. I am not a young man who was looking for something to prove. I did not find out what I was made of in a firefight or a crisis moment with clear lines and a clear enemy. I found it out in a freight bay 4 hours out of a way station, standing over a crate that was warm and breathing, holding an orange laminated tag in my hand. I found it out, and it turned out I already knew. I knew it when I listened in the bay, and I knew it when I came back with the water, and I knew it when I put the tag in my pocket and picked up the phone. I had known it for 31 years the same way I knew every note in my truck's register, not because I ever had to use it, but because it was in there, present, reliable. The thing about knowing what you are is that you don't need a reason once you know. The reasons are for people who are still deciding. I wasn't deciding. I just hadn't been asked before. 6 weeks later, I sold the truck for parts, which it had earned. I drove north on my sister's property the morning after I arrived, out to the ridge where the north view is, and I stood there for a while with the bad hip and the morning light and the receipt in my pocket, and let the last 31 years sit down somewhere behind me. They sat down heavy. That's all right. Heavy is what 31 years earns. The north view is exactly what my sister promised it was.